The Gospel lesson from the 5th chapter of Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Will you pray with me, please? We come, O God, seeking your strength and your hope. And so may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you. Amen. As many of you know, I am an avid hockey fan. These past few weeks with the playoffs have been, for someone like me who enjoys hockey, some of the most exciting days of the entire season. This year, I particularly enjoyed all of the playoffs because my favorite team, the Chicago Blackhawks, won the whole thing. And for this year, they will possess the Stanley Cup. On the other hand, for those of you who are fans of other hockey teams in the National League, it was not as rewarding a finish to the season. So I say to you, too bad, just not your year. And that, my friends, is all the sympathy you're going to get out of me for that. It's interesting when we look at life that so many times sports are used as metaphors for our life experiences. We use sports terms to describe the life that we live. We take many of them from football, terms like the whole 9 yards, or it's fourth down and long yardage, or it's time to punt. And when we say those things, we understand what they mean, that they have significance as to what's going on. But these phrases are common in our language to describe what our life is like. And we use these expressions to explain the ebb and flow that we feel and experience in life. They express the extremes of life that each one of us experience in our journey at some point. There are moments when we win, those moments when we feel like we're absolutely on top of the world, the moments when everything just seems right with the world. As a song from Queen that we all so often hear at sporting events states, "We are the champions of the world." We long for those times. We enjoy those brief moments when we have that feeling. and we cherish those memories of when it has happened. We revel in the midst of times when our world is right. I have no doubt that every single one of us can quickly pull from our memory banks memories of those special times when everything was exactly right in our world. And when we pull those memories up, we once again experience a little bit of that joyful glow, that contentment that we had. Those are our mountaintop experiences in life. And we would love to be on that mountaintop all the time. We'd like to spend the rest of our lives feeling content and joyful. Unfortunately, life does not work that way. We know that because we've also experienced the other extreme, the very opposite end of the spectrum. Sometimes we lose. There are times when we're at the complete opposite end of life where nothing in our world seems to be right. The times we experience events that take us to the very pits of darkness and despair. Those horrific experiences that just seem to shred our very soul. We see it happen, once again, if we use the sports metaphor, with teams or individuals who have worked so hard and devoted everything to try to be the best, only to fall in defeat. We've witnessed that with the World Cup this past week with some of the teams. Or we see the runner who trips and falls during a race. Or the person who's trained so very hard and it's time for their event and they're stopped short by an injury. Or someone whose greatest desire is to be absolutely the best, only to encounter someone who's just a little bit better. These are the experiences in sports that feel like a crushing weight. They're hard to bear. Now, both these times of exhilaration, as well as the moments of crushing despair, are certainly not limited to sports. All of us have seen them happen in our daily lives. We see them around us in our world. We know people who have been at both ends of that spectrum. And we know the reality of both of these extremes, of exhilarating joy, of crushing agony and loss and defeat. We relish the joyful moments, a new birth in the family, a gathering for a wedding or a special birthday, the good news that all of the tests came back normal, the gathering of family and friends to celebrate and laugh. These are special moments. When they happen, we feel content, at peace. We have a certain joy about us. But we also know the dark, crushing other end of the spectrum. The diagnosis we didn't want to hear. The phone call we've been dreading. The end of a relationship. The death of a loved one. The times that feel like they've arrived to simply crush our spirit and send us to an unimaginable darkness. But that is the pendulum of life. For each one of us, that pendulum in life swings back and forth. We experience the extremes of both ends of that swinging arc. We know what it means to experience a great high. And we know also what it means to be brought to a devastating low. Don't you sometimes wish that pendulum would just stop in the middle? Just get in the middle and stay there. You know, there are times that I think boring might be a welcome relief in life. Just stop that swinging back and forth and stay in that boring little place for a while. But it doesn't work that way. Well, our gospel lesson today talks about that swinging pendulum in life. There was a woman who had suffered from a medical ailment for many years, and a father whose daughter was near death or had even died. Both of them went to Jesus for help. Both of them received help. The story tells us the woman was healed, the daughter was raised from death. And as we look at this story, I think it's very important for us to understand not only what this story says, but probably even more importantly, what the story does not say. Sadly, there's been many times when this story has been twisted around and used to hurt the very people who needed the truth of these words. The story does not say, if you have enough faith, you'll be cured of your ailments. Now let me repeat that because it's essential you hear that clearly. The story does not say, if you have enough faith, you'll be cured from all your ailments. I'm ashamed to say I've heard clergy use this story to tell people if they just had more faith, they'd get better. What a horrible misuse of these important words of faith. All of us have known people of faith that we have prayed for. We've even prayed for ourselves for healing that didn't happen. Does that mean we didn't have enough faith? Absolutely not. If that were the case, our faith would be nothing but some kind of an insurance policy. If that were the case, our faith then we would think was some kind of a magical protection that would always cover us. It would be like my saying, I'm a Christian, so I'm protected from everything in life. Nothing bad can ever happen to me. We all know life does not work that way. You see, these stories are not so much about the physical healing, but they're about something much larger and much more important that has taken place and continues to take place today. These are stories about healing, but not about the removal of physical infirmities. What they're really about is what it means to be healed from the disease that steals all of our joy and all of our hope. The one disease that takes everything from us. That disease is fear. Fear is the one thing that steals every bit of joy and hope from our lives. There's two statements that Jesus makes in this passage that make that a very clear thing. In verse 34, we hear Jesus saying, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." In verse 36, he says, "Do not fear, only believe." You see, in most of our lives, the thing that really gets in the way, the thing that harms us the most, the thing that steals everything from us is fear. Life happens. There's really nothing we can do about that. We can't prevent some of the things in life that are going to happen. And faith has very little to do with what happens to us. Faith doesn't give us a magic protection. You can put your money on that. Faith will not give you a magic protection from everything in life. Life will happen. And when it does, we want to know why. Why me? Why someone so nice, so kind? Why now? And we can drive ourselves crazy asking why. We'll never have an answer to that. The truth is there is no answer to why. None that we understand. In Matthew, Jesus said that God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the just and unjust. In other words, God doesn't play favorites. God doesn't say, I'm going to take better care of this group than that group. I like you more than I like them. And I don't care if you're a preacher or a missionary who's devoted their whole life to others, or a deacon or a drunk in the gutter or the most innocent child. Life is going to happen. If you and I are in the wrong place at the wrong time, life can knock us down before we know what's happening. And faith has nothing to do with what might happen to us. However, faith has everything to do with how we handle what happens to us. Jesus said, "Do not fear, your faith has made you well. Be healed of your disease." And that disease that infects our lives, that steals so much from us, is fear. It cripples us. It steals our joy. It steals our hope. So how do we receive that healing? How do we get that healing from that horrible disease of fear? was pretty tough to do it all by ourselves. And that's a part of the reason not why we are here today. We come here to draw strength from one another, but also to bear one another's burdens. There are people in this room who I know can testify how much it has helped them in times of crisis to be with the people of their church who have loved them, supported them, lifted them up. Frederick Buechner explains it this way. He said, it is that life-giving power that is at the heart of this shadowy story about Jairus and the daughter he loved. And that, I believe, is the heart of all of our stories. The power of new life, new hope, new being, whether we know it or not. And I think that takes place, and that's what keeps us coming to places like this year after year in search of it. Somehow it gives us the power to get up even when getting up isn't all that easy for us anymore. And to keep getting up and going on toward whatever it is or whoever He is that all of our lives reaches out to take us by the hand. You see, healing comes in our time together, in our time that we spend with each other, when we encourage each other. We need others in our times of need. We can't do it alone. James Moore tells a very touching story. A business executive had become very depressed. Things weren't going well at work, and he would bring his problems home with him. In the evening, he would eat his dinner in silence, shut out his wife and 5-year-old daughter. Then he would retreat into the den, and he would either read the newspaper or just kind of stare at the wall. After several nights of this, one evening his daughter came in and took her little hand, and she pushed the newspaper aside and jumped up on her father's lap. She wrapped her arms around his neck and hugged him just as hard as she possibly could. The father said, "Honey, you're hugging me to death." The little girl said, "No, Daddy, I'm hugging you back to life." You see, we need that healing touch of others to overcome that disease of fear. We need to be with others to be made well, be made whole. Philip Yancey shares a story about Tony Campolo. Campolo was going to a funeral home to pay his respects to the family of an acquaintance. He walked in, it was a very large funeral home, and he ended up in the wrong parlor in the funeral home. In that parlor was the body of an elderly man, and his widow was the only one there who was a mourner. And she looked so lonely that Campolo said he decided he should stay for the funeral. In fact, he even drove with her out to the cemetery. At the end of the graveside service there at the cemetery, he and the woman had gotten back in the car and were headed back to the funeral home. And Campolo finally confessed to her. He said, "I didn't know your husband." She looked at him and says, "I thought as much because I didn't recognize you. But it really doesn't matter." And as she squeezed his arm, she said, "You'll never know what this meant to me." As Buechner said, we need to be together in this place. We need to gather. And today we gather at this special table. And we can never quite explain the healing that we get when we gather at this communion table. But there's something about taking that small piece of bread and that cup that changes us. It's a feast that reminds us that God understands our suffering, understands our pain. It reminds us that we're never alone, that love is never gone, that God is always with us. Our journey in life is always going to be on that pendulum, back and forth, from joy to sorrow, and all the things in between. But we know that God will ride that pendulum with us. King Duncan describes it this way. He said, "I don't pretend to know the mind of God. I'm a searcher just as you are a searcher. But I do know this. In my seasons of highs and lows, I've noticed something peculiar. I rarely learn much of anything from pleasure, but I have learned volumes from pain. Don't get me wrong, I prefer pleasure. Only someone foolish would prefer pain. But I've noticed that where the highs make me glow, the lows have made me grow. What's the disease that steals the most from us? It's fear. Yet we talk about being a people of faith. So if we truly believe that God is with us, even though our bodies might be sick, our spirits can be made healthy. Our faith makes us well. It won't save us from sickness. It won't save us from death. But it will give us peace. It will remove all that fear. So come today to this place to touch and to be touched by Christ at this table by one another. And your faith will make you well. You can be cured of the disease of fear. Your faith and the faith of those who gather with you truly can make you whole and complete. Amen.